A 20-year-old man swipes furiously at two different phones, his eyes darting between Tinder and Hinge. It's a race against time. He needs to find someone to have sex with that night. He has to. The phone pings. He has a match, and he's out the door to continue his no-holds-barred, orgy-like lifestyle. At least that's what parents and the media believe is happening. But in fact, reality has gone the opposite way. Adult Gen Zers are having less sex and staying virgins longer than any generation before them at their age. So, what happened? So, what's really going on behind closed doors? Or rather, what's not? We'll deep dive into the sexless generation in today's episode of The Infographic Show. Why Gen Zers are having less sex than other generations. These past couple of years, the media has had a strange complaint about Gen Z. Teens and college-age kids aren't having enough sex. Dubbed the Puriteen generation, Gen Z, those born between 1997 and 2012, is gaining a reputation for their supposed prudish attitudes toward sex. But aren't they supposed to be the most sexually open and progressive generation? So which is it? Well, it turns out it's a little of both. For Gen Z, growing up meant being surrounded by sexual imagery and having instant access to porn, literally at the click of a button. 18-year-old high school student Lillian shares her perspective. A lot of heterosexual porn always felt graphic. There was always an element of violence to it, and I never truly felt like any of the women or AFAB individuals in it were enjoying it, she says. That was very disturbing to me. One 20-year-old blamed porn for also making real-life sex off-putting, describing her experiences thus far as meh to bad. She said her partners seemed to model their moves on porn, flipping me over every 2 seconds because they watch a lot of mainstream porn. No wonder she doesn't want to have sex again. It doesn't help that Gen Z is struggling with mental health a lot. UC Irvine College student Ivana Zuniga told the LA Times, "I've been really preoccupied with my studies and I'm always stressed because of all the things I have going on. My libido is always shot and I don't really ever think about sex." While Gen Z has popularized a more fluid sexual spectrum and a variety of identity labels, this cultural shift may for some be making them less open to sexual experiences than before. How? Well, let's dig into the data and find out. One study in California looked into the sexual habits of young adults over time. In 2011, 22% of both men and women aged 18 to 30, millennials, reported having no sexual partners in the previous year. By 2021, 33% of women and 43% of men reported having no sexual partners in the last year. And this trend isn't just some quirky California phenomenon. The U.S. General Social Survey looked specifically at men under 25, and the percentage who reported no sexual activity in the past year had jumped from 18.9% in 2000 to 30.9% in 2018. Another study found that Gen Z specifically reported less sex than millennials and Gen Xers. 25% of Gen Z adults said they have never had sex with a partner in their lives. Though rates of sexual activity are going down among both genders, there is a more pronounced difference with men, and a lot of people think it's a result of porn, loneliness, and lockdown. During the pandemic, people stuck at home alone turned to porn and online content for sexual satisfaction. Psychologist Fred Rabinowitz said young men are watching a lot of social media and they're watching a lot of porn, and they're getting a lot of their needs met without having to go out. The numbers paint a revealing picture. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, the percentage of women describing themselves as single edged up slightly from 32% in 2019 to 34% in 2022. But for men, the increase is far more dramatic, going from 51% to 63%. And it's not just because they're striking out. Only half of single men say they're even interested in casual or committed relationships, a sharp decline from 61% just a few years earlier. Many psychologists think this decrease in sex is reflective of something more serious, a decrease in overall human connection. Thanks to the influence of social media, online lifestyles, pandemic isolation, and helicopter parenting, Gen Z might be the loneliest generation thus far. As NYU psych professor Niobe Way says, we're in a crisis of connection. Disconnection from ourselves and disconnection from each other. And it's getting worse. And that may be why men are disproportionately affected. This is backed up by data. Back in the 1990s, just over half of men, 55%, reported having 6 or more close friends. By 2021, that number had dropped to just 27%, less than half of what it was a generation ago. Even more troubling, 15% of men now say they don't have a single close friend, a drastic rise from just 3% in 1990. While loneliness is affecting both men and women, with 61% of Americans overall feeling the effects, it does affect men more. Men also say they're less likely to get emotional support from friends unless they have close female friends. If friendships are difficult for Gen Z, dating, sex, and romantic relationships must be an even bigger challenge. The lockdown has also caused a big disruption to Gen Zers' sexual habits, in a way millennials and Gen Xers never had to deal with. It caught many of them in high school and college. Instead of navigating crushes at school or hanging with friends, they were stuck at home, limited to awkward interactions on Zoom, possibly the least sexy environment in the world. This period of isolation created a kind of suspended development for many Gen Zers. They became a little too comfortable with being alone and a little too scared of forming connections. Once again, men seem to have been more deeply affected. In 2021, a Match.com study found that 81% of single men said sex was less of a priority than it had been for them before the pandemic. Perhaps this explains why so many are turning to online alternatives like porn. For many, it feels easier, safer even, than taking the emotional risk of forming real-life human connections. But part of the problem is that Gen Z has had access to porn on a scale previous generations could not have imagined. Forget sneaking a Playboy out of dad's closet. Today's teens were exposed to some of the internet's darkest corners from a very, some might say, inappropriately young age. Surprisingly, coming across Blue's Clues fan fiction porn before you've even kissed someone does something to you. And that something is not good. You get exposed to a lot of sex before you've even had a chance to experience the attraction or connection it's usually based on. And as mentioned before, a lot of online porn doesn't necessarily look happy for the people involved. Even Gen Z icon Billie Eilish has opened up about the effects of early exposure to porn. She revealed in an interview that she started watching porn at just 11 years old, and it completely messed her up. Eilish says, "I think it really destroyed my brain, and I feel incredibly devastated that I was exposed to so much porn." She said that when she started having sex, she wouldn't say no to things that felt uncomfortable or wrong because she thought she was supposed to enjoy them based on what she had seen in porn. And people, especially young people, are watching a lot of porn. One study found that sites like Pornhub, Xvideos, and XNXX had more traffic than every other site in the US except Amazon and Yahoo. 27% of this Pornhub traffic is made up of 18 to 24-year-olds. In 2023, the website reported it had more than 100 million visits per day, which means more monthly visits than those to Netflix, TikTok, Pinterest, and Instagram combined. This doesn't even account for platforms like OnlyFans, where people can have customized porn made for them by creators they follow. For the youngest members of Gen Z, studies found that 73% of teens aged 13 to 17 have already watched porn, with 54% having seen it by the time they were just 13 years old. To put that into perspective, most preteens at that age hadn't even had their first kiss. Most troublingly, 45% of teens said they felt they got helpful information about sex from watching porn, since unfortunately most of them are not getting it from abstinence-only schools. This is translating into practices that are sending a lot of Gen Z members fleeing from sex in general. Because, as it turns out, there's usually a reason porn stars need payment before doing what they do. It's often not that enjoyable off camera. Author Kate Julian, who has spent years researching the challenges facing today's teens and young adults, says that young adults are experiencing more types of sex made popular by porn, like choking and anal sex. Even people in Gen Z who have positive views of porn think it can negatively affect their ability to sexually engage with people in real life. 23-year-old Cameron, a student in Minnesota, said that porn sometimes has unrealistic expectations of what sex can be. He was personally troubled when he realized that the more he relied on porn, he had less of a capacity to form relationships or to be content in a relationship sexually. But not everyone's realizing that the moves they see in porn are frequently unrealistic and not pleasurable for their partners. One study showed that 30% of women said they had experienced pain during penis and vagina sex, and 72% of them had experienced pain with anal sex. Part of the reason for this is that while those who like rough sex should be free to enjoy it, a lot of people who don't like it feel pressured to have it all the same. Indiana University Bloomington School of Public Health Director Debbie Herbenick says rough sex behaviors are really normalized among young people, thanks partly to porn. This may be why some members of Gen Z are fighting back against the ubiquity of sex in the media in general. One UCLA study found that 51.5% of 13 to 24-year-olds would like to see media portraying more friendships and other platonic relationships. 44.3% thought romance in media is overused. And interestingly, 39% would like to see more aromantic and asexual characters on screen. This brings us to the topic of Gen Z and their attitudes towards sexuality. They are the most open-minded generation thus far, and the most likely to identify as not exclusively straight. Around 20 to 25% of Gen Z identify as somewhere on the LGBTQIA spectrum. But for some people, the more labels that appear, the more intimidating it feels to experiment with and discover their sexuality. Are they queer, bisexual, or pansexual? Are they aromantic or asexual? Maybe sapiosexual? LA-based therapist Tori Efron Pelton frequently encounters this problem with her younger patients. Many feel intense pressure to explore their sexuality freely, even when they're not ready or unsure about it. At that same time, they're also expected to pick a label early on and stick with it, often before they've had the chance to truly understand who they are or what they want. This makes the whole idea of sex and exploration very intimidating for some, and it causes a lot of stress and anxiety around it. Pelton emphasizes to her patients that they can go at whatever pace works for them, and they don't need to attach labels to themselves the second they turn 18. They can just live their life and see what works for them. Of course, the labels are far from the biggest thing causing stress and anxiety in Gen Z. As today's parents and pharmacists know very well, Gen Z has the worst mental health of any generation that came before it. It was made even worse when they got stuck inside a house during the pandemic. They missed out on typical teenage experiences, learning how to socialize and become independent in general. Research found that 42% of Gen Zers struggle with depression, while only 23% of Americans over the age of 25 do. Anxiety is also a huge issue, with 61% of Gen Z having a medical diagnosis of anxiety or an anxiety-related condition. Not only do mental health struggles kill sexual desire, but the medications for them, like many antidepressants, also have the side effect of killing libido. It's no wonder Gen Z is never in the mood. Unfortunately, this creates a vicious cycle. Multiple studies show that regular sex significantly improves mental and physical health. These benefits include a stronger immune system, better sleep, and an improved ability to identify and express emotions. It also triggers the release of feel-good hormones like oxytocin, which promote bonding and reduce stress. According to Kate Julian, a lot of this generational anxiety has developed as a result of sky-high family expectations and helicopter parents. Parents are perhaps justifiably more anxious about their kids' future, as both millennials and Gen Z are rumored to be the first generations that will do worse than their parents in life. This creates immense pressure on kids. They're expected to focus intensely on their studies while also juggling extracurricular activities. All of this is aimed at building resumes that will impress universities and future employers. A lot of Gen Zers end up feeling very anxious and overwhelmed because of all of this extra pressure. Not to mention, having parents hovering around them all the time isn't helping. The fact that they're not hitting adult milestones as quickly as generations before them also contributes to frustration and low self-esteem. Members of Gen Z are living with their parents longer, getting their driver's license later, and waiting longer to find a paying job outside of school. To be fair, the competitive demands placed on them by universities and even high schools these days leaves little free time for work, and the salary from a minimum wage part-time job will barely cover gas money, unlike in the 1960s when you could work at McDonald's and buy a house before hitting 30. This trend of developing into adulthood at a slower pace makes sense sociologically, especially in Western countries. As Jean Twenge, professor of psychology at San Diego State University, says, in times and places where people live longer and education takes longer, the whole developmental trajectory slows down. And so far for teens and young adults, one place that you're going to notice that is in terms of dating and romantic relationships and sexuality. In other words, people who don't feel like full-grown adults yet are going to be less likely to do adult things, like having sex and date. She adds that Gen Z puts off sex and dating due to their increasingly economically precarious status, or stress related to completing education and looking for jobs. In other words, I guess we spent the late 1900s messing up the world and the economy in that order. Whoops, sorry. When people are stressed about earning enough to pay rent, afford food, and simply survive, priorities shift. Add to that their free time spent Googling probability of World War III or what the polar ice caps melting means, and then suddenly hitting on that cute girl at the bar feels, well, less important. This theory is all backed up by data that shows lower-income young adults have way less sex than high-income Gen Zers. 52% of Californians under the poverty line reported having no sex in the past year, while only 33% of high-income young adults between the ages of 18 and 30 reported having no sex. Money may not buy you love, but apparently it does help you feel good enough to have sex. There's also a practical way these trends of delayed adulthood get in the way of sex and dating. Many young adults are living with their parents, without a car, and with limited disposable income. That makes it harder to get out into the world, meet people, and build the connections that lead to sex or meaningful relationships. Living with your parents also makes bringing your partners home awkward, to say the least. Nothing kills the mood like your mom reminding you to clean your room in the morning when you walk into your house with your date. While many of the reasons behind Gen Z's decline in sexual activity are either beyond their control or tied to negative factors, not everyone sees this as a problem. Some young people and experts are challenging the idea that having less sex is necessarily a bad thing. For example, Gen Z is more aware of labels and different kinds of sexuality, meaning for the first time, lots of people are recognizing that they are asexual. That's the case for nursing assistant Rhodes, who says, "I'm glad people have fun with sex and it works for them, but I think sex is kinda gross." 1% of Gen Z identifies as asexual. For them, not having sex is simply being true to themselves and not conforming to what society is pressuring them to do. A lot of people in Gen Z, especially women, also mention that having less casual sex or less sex because they don't feel pressured to do it is a good thing. They see the sex-positive mindset popularized during the millennial era as somewhat naive. In their opinion, a lot of millennial women ended up pressured to do what men wanted them to do in bed anyway to appear sexually free and progressive. So, what'll happen in the future? Will people have less and less sex until we cease to exist as a species? It's unlikely. But as more people prioritize online dopamine hits and virtual connections, in-person relationships and experiences take a back seat. For many young people, this means sex is falling further down the priority list. The less sex trend might reverse a little, as each generation tends to push back on what the generation before them did. Millennials were seen as the sex-positive generation, so it's no surprise that Gen Z was sick of all the sex talk by the time they came of age. Maybe Gen Alpha will make fun of Gen Zers for being prudes and make sex positivity cool again. But for that to happen, issues like mental health and financial stability for young people have to be seriously discussed and addressed. Now, what do you think about Gen Z's attitude about sex? If you're part of Gen Z and you have an opinion, we would love to hear from you in the comments. Now go check out Every Generation Explained in 10 minutes, or click on this video instead.